But now to me, with my arguments, what I'm arguing is that verses 1 and 2 cannot be a part of day one. And yes, I'll be happy to argue against Wenham and everyone else that wants to disagree with me, but they can't be. One of the reasons is if you take verses 1 and 2 as part of day one, it destroys the symmetrical structure of Genesis, period. The entire chapter. Because now days 1 through 6 no longer coordinate. So like all of a sudden it's like, hey, look, if you start in verse 3, there's this incredible symmetry throughout the entire creation account. If you start in verse 1, there isn't. Stephen, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's a real joy to be on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I always love conversing with other Christians who are really serious about studying the Bible and the integrity of what the Bible actually says and how it should apply to our lives. I find the Christians who just hold the Bible as another book and they're like, I like this part, I don't like that part. It's difficult for me to take them that seriously.
Right? Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. Totally agree with you.
So tell me just a little bit about what is it you're doing on your YouTube channel and your ministry?
Yeah, so I kind of started my YouTube channel just following my own interest, things that was interested in. One of the things I was particularly interested in was the Byzantine text. So there's a lot of the Byzantine text is pretty much represented by the majority of our Greek witnesses. And so one of the things, there were a lot of like YouTube channels out there that were defending like the text that underlies specifically the King James Version, like the Textus Receptus. And there weren't a lot of channels defending something like the Byzantine text or the majority text. And I thought, well, since there's not very much content like that, I'll make some of that. And I also just had a bunch of topics I just wanted to explore. But I also sort of I like books. And so part of the idea that I had in my head was if I start reviewing some books, maybe people will start sending them to me for free. And now I've pretty much gotten out of too many of the book reviews. I have to do some here and there, but so the YouTube channel has just kind of grown just as my interest. Yep, like today I made a video. I haven't posted it yet on the difference between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. I'm neither one, and so, but I have both that watch my channel, and I thought, okay, what's the difference here? What's the key differences? And so, yeah, so you'll find just about anything on my YouTube channel.
So what you're telling us is why the KJV is the inspired, only inerrant word of God, right?
No, but the funny thing though is I love the King James Version. I grew up with the King James Version and it's beautiful to me. And so I've made videos about why I love the King James Version. And so then I've had a bunch of King James onlyists that have followed my channel who have subsequently become quite angry with me when they find out that I'm not in that camp. So I occupy an interesting space where I think the King James version is wonderful and beautiful, and I wish people would read it just for its, if nothing else, its literary value. I mean, it's like, if you're going to invest in Shakespeare, the King James version is worth investing in as well, just because it's shaped our culture. And so, yeah. So, anyways, yeah. So I've attracted all sorts of different sorts of people that watch my channel, which is great.
That is great. But I have run into a few different people in interesting situations concerning the KJV. I was in a X space like probably a few weeks ago now, but he was out there espousing eschatology and all of his views. And he was explaining, oh, this word, here, here, and here. He's using 3 different verses. And he's like, yeah, but see, it's different word here. And it's like, oh, and he's talking about the end times. Like, this is how you know there's 3 raptures because of this. And I was looking these up because I was pretty sure I knew what it was in my head. And he's like, yeah. And you can only see this in the King James Version. And I was thinking, oh my gosh. And I did and looked it up in the Greek and I called him on it. and basically said, like, look, man, this is exactly the same word in the Greek in all three things.
Mm-hmm.
And his response is like, well, he's like, I don't really care, about that, about the Greek or any of those other things. And I basically said, it's like, if you don't care about the Greek, you don't care about what the New Testament says.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, and he's like, and that's pretty much what he said. He's like, no, you need the King James version, and that's the only one that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I watched your debate with what was the young Earth creationist?
Kent.
Kent. Yeah. 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 Kent. What's his
Oh
last name?
yeah.
Uh,
Hovid.
Hovine. Yes, I
Hovind.
should. That
Hovind.
should be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should be right off the. That should be right on the tip of my tongue there.
That
But
proves
it's
that proves you're not a good young Earth creationist. If you don't know Kent Hovind's first and last, like it's part of their doctrinal statement, right?
depends on which circles, I guess. I always thought that he never had. Um, if he's gonna, I don't know if he'll watch this. Probably, maybe unlikely, but I wouldn't want to hurt his feelings. But I had never
I
thought he
wouldn't
was
worry
that.
about that.
Yeah, I never thought he was very serious. Um, I always thought that he was sort of on the fringes of everything. In my view, when I'd heard, even as an old Earth creationist, looking in on the young Earth creationist movement, I I thought that he was on the edges. Now I've moved into a young Earth creationist position, but I never thought he was that serious. But one of the reasons I didn't take him too seriously is because when I heard him talk about things that I was pretty conversant in, he spoke
Mm.
with such confidence and such, even in the debate, like when he was talking to you about the Antiochian text. This is all, foreign to your audience now, unless they've watched that debate. But now we plugged the debate, I guess. It was so clear that he didn't have a clue what he was talking about, but yet he could just pontificate it so with so much confidence. And it really, when I heard him speak on textual issues, which I know better than science in regards to like the age of the earth, I realized he could be doing the exact same thing with some of the stuff that I'm not really in a good position to verify, if you follow what I mean.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I was actually just talking about that a little bit as the most recent scandal with Billy has just came out. I don't know if you've seen that
I
with Billy
haven't.
and Wes. Okay, so Billy, anyway, he's a big time YouTuber, and he's been all over. He even made it on the Joe Rogan podcast,
Oh.
and he actually spouts a bunch of nonsense, utter ridiculousness. If you know any of the, but he brings up things like these other ancient texts, and he just asserts, oh yeah, this is like pretty much a word for word copy of Genesis, and it's like, no, it's not. Like it's not. And so he finally had a debate with a legitimate scholar named Wes, and Wes smashed him, like
Mm,
just utterly showed this dude does not have any idea what he's talking about, you
mm,
know.
mhm.
And of course, Billy now is suing Wes, and there's a whole bunch of stuff over it. But
Wow.
anyway, because he's a fraud. I mean,
Mhm,
just to be plain and simple, he's a fraud. He literally just lies. Like it's not even remotely close. So
mhm,
anyway,
mhm.
but he does it with such utter confidence and surety, oh yeah, well that's, this and this and this. And for those, because he's been on so many shows, and everyone else just kind of goes, oh yeah, like, wow, really, that's what it says,
Yeah, right. Right. Yes. Yes.
so yeah, that's annoying to me compared to real scholars. And it's it's unfortunate. I know I've experienced this myself where, somebody might be like, hey Adam, what about this? And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the most likely true, and I might be like 80% certain,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And so the other person's like, I don't know, Adam doesn't sound like he's sure, right? And somebody else will be like, oh no, it's definitely this, right? And
mhm,
they're 100% sure, when in reality they don't know what they're talking about.
mhm, mhm.
And it's just really annoying when you have this contrast. And the truth is, real scholars, well, yeah, they're calculated because they know there's all this vast array of possibilities.
Yeah.
you know it's the whole, oh, what do they call it, the something effect, with the monkey, a Dunning-Kruger effect.
Mm, mhm, mhm,
The Dunning-Kruger effect is like this idea that the more you know, the less certain you are, but the less you know, the more certain you are.
mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah, no, it Yeah, I've seen that too, and you do see sometimes when you hear experts talk, a lot of times they'll say, "Well, this isn't my area of specialization," and you know, they'll hesitate. They'll have some hesitation about veering into other people's domains, whereas the fool is an expert in everything. You know,
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah, there should be a shirt for that.
Uh,
I'll have to see about that one.
yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about both these subjects, but you know
hmm
what? Guest choice today. You want to talk about the age of the earth first or Greek?
Well, I want to talk about the age of the Earth because I watched
Let's
both
do
your
it.
debates, and I and I moved to a. So you and I went the opposite directions. So you were a
Yeah.
young Earth creationist who has now become, I think, an old Earth creationist, or at least you're. I think at minimum you would probably say that you're just the Bible's. You're agnostic about what the Bible says about, or the Bible's agnostic about the age of the Earth, right? It could be
Yes.
trillions of
Yeah.
years old. It could be thousands of years old. The Bible doesn't really say. I think that's the position that you're at.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and so whereas I've moved to a young Earth position, and like I said, I watched a couple of your debates, and I thought they were interesting. I think it's really fun to be able to have debates because those, you know, they bring out certain things and you get to hear different perspectives. But there's things that happen in conversations that can't happen as well in debates because, you know, the conversation that I'm having with you, I'm trying to gain understanding, right? And it's
Yeah.
probably not as click worthy when you're doing that as opposed to trying, you know, you're trying to there is a little bit of vying there, right? So you know, there's a little bit of one-upmanship that can kind of take place in those, and that's because you're not trying to persuade the person who's on the other side. You're really trying to persuade the audience, right? So it's a different sort of environment. So I was curious. So when you had those debates, you defended, as far as I could see, a very narrow, a very small field, right? Basically, which is wise from a debate standpoint. Like you want to defend a very narrow. You don't want to defend everything, right? You want to defend something that's as narrow as possible. So far as I could see, you defended the notion that the first day of Genesis starts in verse 3, Genesis 1:3,
Mhm.
and so therefore really we have a genealogy that goes back to Adam. If you want to say that Adam is part of the 6 days of creation, which is most people would, um, but still we can't get past verse 3. So whatever happened in verse 1, verse 2, there's no chronological markers there. So that could be eons of time as far as what we know. Is that a fair
Mhm.
summary of what you were defending in those debates?
Yeah, I just want to commend you right on, right for the get. Yeah, that is correct. That is correct. And I think one of the most frustrating things is saying lots of great stuff and everyone not saying anything remotely close to your actual argument. So yeah, that's exactly correct. And I want to be clear in one other aspect. If somebody wants to be a young Earth creationist, that's great. But one of my biggest ambitions is for people to be more educated on the topic. Because in my experience, and I'll just say more often with young Earth creationists than not, they were just very uneducated on the subject.
Hmm.
It's one thing if you want to hold a view, but it's to me just bad form if you want to espouse a view and just be ignorant of the data in the text, let alone anything else. And so I really think that that makes Christians look bad when they're so ignorant. And at least if you're going to out there making a claim and defending a position or defending Christianity, then understand what's going on here. And so, um, thank you for watching the debates. That's more than most have done. And I do feel like one of the things that I did through that and that I got some comments on was that I presented something that I would say a lot more people said, I learned something new. I'd never heard this or that. And so, yeah. Yes, you've correctly assessed everything.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was an interesting approach. So if this conversation unfolds, let me tell you like a little bit about my journey, and then we can kind of pull that out. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
that
So
sounds great.
yeah, so my journey was like this. I was an old Earth creationist, and I had a sort of a gap theory. That was where I kind of started. I didn't think the day age theory really works. So the gap theory was that there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and
Hmm.
so you can tack a lot onto that. Some people said, well, that was when Satan fell and the earth became tohu vabohu, that whole kind of thing. It's ruin, destruction. And then in verse 3, then you go into day 1, right? So then the Lord's restoring the earth back to its pristine state that it had in Genesis 1:1. But like I like that view, but it was hard to find any scholarship, modern scholarship, that would support that sort of sequence. So I had a lot of reservation about it. Um, but and then I sort of shifted to John Selhammer's view. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but what what he did is he made a move. So Bereshit at the beginning there is in the beginning, right, or in a beginning, whatever. But that Bereshit would also be used in regards to like the reign of kings, and so in the beginning could be a long stretch of time. So he put the time in there. So at the Bereshit was a long period of time God's creating.
Hmm.
So it was kind of almost like a modified gap theory by a reputable Hebraist, right? John Selhammer was a well-known evangelical scholar. I think he's passed away now.
He's not
Um,
well known anymore.
well,
I'm
yeah,
just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
kidding.
That definitely still well known. Um, but so I took that. So I kind of moved to that view, and then but I wasn't real certain about it. So I kind of came to the position like, okay, I'm more certain that the earth is old than I am that there's not than I am that the Bible teaches that the earth is young. Does that make sense? So like for me,
Mhm.
both is I believe in inerrancy, so both have got to be true. The record in nature and the record in scripture both have to be true. So I said, I'm more certain that nature's telling me that the earth is old than I am that the Bible's teaching that it's young. So I kind of came to that position. But then I had to come to the point where, um, and stop me if I'm filibustering here, but
You're doing fine.
okay. So, so then I had to teach my kids about Noah, right? That always been a local flood for me. And I thought, is that really what I think the Bible's teaching? Do I really think that it's a local flood? And I came to the conclusion I can't teach my kids that because I'm not sure I really believe that's what the Bible's teaching. Then I realized if you believe in a global flood, you're pretty much a young Earth creationist, uh, right? I mean, like I understand that won't fly in a debate, right? With if we were debating this, that wouldn't work because that's not the narrow parameters that you're defending. But if you think that everything started over with Noah and everything came off that ark a few thousand years ago, I mean, you are not in scientific mainstream. That's almost harder to swallow, right? Than a young Earth from certain standpoints. I thought, okay, well, I'm still going to hang on to an old Earth. I'll just be a global flood guy and still have an old Earth. And I thought kind of something like you did, like some things happen in Genesis 1:1, 1:2. Maybe those. So I began to think of it like this: I have a genealogical record and it's so and so lived so many years and begat so and so. It's like a chain, right? So it's a chain that goes all the way back to Adam. So if I get back to Adam, then one move you could make, John Walton made this move, or at least proposed it, is that maybe you get Adam out of the 6 days of creation, right? So you could break the chain there. But I've really
Mhm.
thought, no, I don't think the Bible's teaching that. I think Adam was part of the 6 days of creation. So I couldn't break a link there. The only place I could find a link to break was somewhere between 1, 2, or 3, right? Or, you know, in those first 3 verses. And then it was, and this came up in your debates, but I didn't really hear you speak too much into it. Then, so I was kind of still maybe trying to cling to something like John Selhammer's view, but I just kept running. Like when someone brought up to me Exodus 20:11, which you're very familiar with, it's like it sort of fell apart. It's like that pretty much connects the whole thing. For those who are listening, Exodus 20 11 is, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and all that is in them, which seems to be linking back to me to Genesis 1:1. And I had to move out from my gap theory days was, oh, one is bara and the other one's what is it, asa, so I've got two different verbs here, so I can really make some movement there. And it just all sort of fell apart for me. And I finally, to me, just sort of yielded to what I think the scripture was teaching. And one of the other things that kind of nudged me that direction is I realized that if I debated somebody like Kurt Wise, who has a PhD from Harvard University, studied under Stephen Jay Gould, um, one of the world's most eminent paleontologists at the time, and Kurt Wise and I had a debate, a scientific debate about the age of the earth, he would mop the floor with me. So and then someone in my YouTube, as I was wrestling with this, I was posting videos about it, somebody in my YouTube channel said something like this: it's so obvious what the age of the earth is from what the scripture teaches that you'd have to have a PhD to deny it. And it just smote my heart. I'm like, okay, I'm going to yield to this position. So sorry for taking so much of the time, but I just thought it'd be interesting to sort of unravel our different takes. So
Yeah, and you know what? So I really appreciate those who are committed to the scriptures, committed to the Bible. And that's one of the reasons that I also like kind of framed my arguments in that fashion. So for example, like the first debate I did was against Matt, and I'd talked to him prior, and the whole thing was is like, hey, look, if I showed you scientific evidence, like would it matter to you? And he's like, no.
mhm.
Well, why not? Because the Bible says, right? So it's like, okay, cool. Then why would we talk about science? If that's not going to move the needle, then why would we waste our time? Why spend our time? And so I spent all my time talking about, well, what does the Bible say? Now, I want to have a small comment about this, and this doesn't necessarily move things one way or another, but the reason that I feel like the agnostic position is the correct position is number one, for those that want to claim that the Bible teaches an old earth, I just don't think that's true.
Hmm.
Like, and it's really articulated in what you said. Yeah, I'm looking for a place to fit in the time,
Mhm.
you know? And it's like, yeah, you can kind of do that. But to me, it is eisegesis pure and simple. Like, I don't know any other way around that. And so the only one that you could legitimately potentially hold, yeah, is like a young earth view that the Bible teaches the earth is young, and therefore you need to conclude that it's young. It's like, okay, if that's the case, that can make sense. I don't think that you can say that the Bible teaches that the earth is old. Like there's nothing in there that says, and the earth was fill in the
Mhm.
blank.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I do think that the Bible just doesn't say. I think it leaves the question open. And so I don't exactly say that like, oh, I'm just I have no idea
Right.
what the age of the earth is. I'm saying that the Bible just doesn't say. So I'm definitively saying the Bible doesn't say it. So I do want to declare against both the old and the young earth creationist. It doesn't say that it's old, and it doesn't say that it's young. So yeah, my primary contention is that yes, I wanted to get at what is Genesis 1 saying, and want to see like how is it expressing it. And so I think that Genesis 1 is saying that the earth was created and all that in it was created beginning in verse 3. And it was created out of the status of the earth, that the earth was void and formless and there was darkness over the surface of the deep. And so to answer kind of this Exodus 20 objection, because it's probably the biggest verse that hangs people up, and I understand. I really I understand. But if I say I created my house in 3 months, right? Nobody thinks I created it out of nothing. I created my house and all that is in it in 3 months. I created the pool and the bathtub and the washroom and everything in 6 months or 3 months or whatever. Okay, cool. Then everyone will be like, oh, cool. What kind of materials did you use? That's not an illegitimate question to ask. What kind of materials did you use? Well, I just told you I created the whole thing. Okay, cool. And I just think that the text, to be blunt, is actually quite clear that it is out of the void and all of this stuff. Now, what is What is the void and all this other stuff? It is the earth, because it says, and there was darkness over the surface of the deep, right? And the earth was void and formless. So what does it say? Well, it says there's an earth. The earth was void and formless. It doesn't say there was nothing, and there was nothing. It says the earth was void and formless. And so, one of the questions that I have often asked young earth creationists, to which, in my opinion, they don't give a good answer, is on what day did God create water?
Hmm. Yeah, I heard that come up in your debate. And you don't think that the answer that it had to be within that 6-day framework is answered by Exodus? I guess it doesn't answer it specifically, right? But the fact that he created the seas, that doesn't cover it for you?
Well, because Exodus, right?
Mhm.
It's going back to Genesis, right?
Mhm.
So I should read Genesis 1 to know what Exodus is referring to, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to me it's like, I mean, and I may be responding to something you're not saying. So,
No
but
worries.
to me, when I heard this kind of come up in one of your debates, I don't remember which one it was. To me, I look at Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 as almost um the author Moses, or the divine author, giving authoritative commentary, as it were, on Genesis 1. So I think one of the things that had come up in your debate, maybe this is not what you're saying, is that we shouldn't use Exodus to exegete Genesis 1, right?
Mhm.
Is that kind of what you're getting at there, or maybe not?
Yeah. Because if Genesis 1 is clear in what it's saying, then when I get to Exodus, like I understand. So let me give you a clear example of what I mean. When it's talking about God created the waters, to me, it seems like he's talking about what it says in day two, which is he separated the waters, right?
Hmm.
That's what is mean by the act of creating the waters, is he separated the waters above and the waters below, right? And then he separated the water from the land. That is the creative act. But if he is merely separating the waters, that is a creative act, is not a creation out of nothing, because it presupposes that the waters already exist.
Mm. So in the sequence that you're laying out here, so that, and you're aware of this, and maybe this is a little complicated, but I'm not a Hebraeus, so you can help me here. But my understanding is there's basically three understandings on how to understand Genesis 1:1, right? So basically, you can understand it as an independent clause, right, and then
Mhm.
these others follow from it. You can understand it as a summary
Mhm.
clause. It's just a summary of everything that happens, and then basically the action starts. Camera starts rolling in verse 2, and so that you have pre-existent matter, pre-existent earth, etc. And then another view would see the subordinate clause. How does that work?
It's a
Verse 2,
dependent clause.
dependent clause. Yeah.
Mhm.
And but anyways, of those views, which one are you laying out here? Are you saying, how do you see Genesis 1:1? Do you see this as a sequence here from Genesis 1:1, and then God does something actually in 1:1? Does anything actually happen in verse 1?
So, okay, so this actually could get into much deeper Hebrew,
Hmm.
but let me run you three different scenarios, just like
Yeah.
you've painted, right? Let's imagine it's a independent clause,
Yeah.
right? So that Genesis 1:1, just verse 1, says that God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. So if that's the case, then it seems to me like there is creation prior to day one, because the official day one of the 6 days of creation begins in verse 3. And so, therefore, on verse interpretation number one, there is already creation made. In other words, God makes the universe, the heavens, the earth, and everything in them prior to the first day of the 6 days of creation. In which case, again, you do not know when the universe was created, because it is created in the beginning. So let's say that we take a second view, the summary view. The summary view basically would be the idea that, okay, verses 1 and 2, they're not acts of creation at all, right? But instead they're kind of a general summary of what God is going to do, right? In some sense, God is about to create the heavens and the earth is void and formless, and the Spirit of God hovers over the darkness and all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
So, in the summary view, to me, this still doesn't get you to a young earth creation conclusion, because the reason is that, okay, it's a summary statement, which means that it is not telling you about anything that actually happened, right? So it's not telling you about anything that actually happened. But then once you begin verse 3, the following 6 days of creation all assume that verse 2 existed and was real. Verse 2 existed and was real. So this isn't a statement about verse 1 as much. Now, you could say that God created independent laws, and then verse 2 is the earth was void, formless, there's darkness. So, but every day appeals back to verse 2. And so you have this idea of like, okay, there's void and formlessness and there's darkness. So it's like, why did God separate the light from the darkness on day 1? Oh, because there was darkness over the surface of the deep. It's like, well, how do you know there was darkness over the surface of the deep? Because it told me in verse 2. Oh,
Mhm.
God is separating the waters above and the waters below. Well, why is he doing that? Well, because it was formless. And now he's drawing the line, so to speak. Oh, and then he separates again on day 3. Oh, and then he's putting in plants, animals, and these things. Why is he putting in plants, animals, and these things? Oh, because it was empty, right? He's filling in the blocks. So all of the days are appealing to that which was already there. For example, like I mentioned earlier, the water. How could he separate the waters from the land? Well, because he mentions they're already there. So you have some type of pre existent earth prior to the first day of creation. And therefore, to me, you cannot say with any certainty that you know when that physical material part of the earth was created on the summary view. So then you have the third one. The third one today is actually very popular amongst Hebraists today. So if you actually get into a lot of the literature today, many scholars have, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but many of them actually translate Genesis 1 as when God created the heavens and the earth. And
Mhm.
so when you just say when God created the heavens and the earth, it actually directly links it to verse 2. And so they say that this is a dependent clause in which when God created the earth was void and formless and all these things. And so again, what does this show? Each one of these interpretations shows that there is a pre-existent earth prior to the first day of the 6 days of creation. And so when Exodus 20 talks about Genesis and the creation account, it is appealing to the 6-day creation account. And I think that is the point of all of this is it's talking about a 6-day creation account. Now, our assumption is or has been that that is the beginning of all time, space, matter, energy, and so on and so forth. And one of the small arguments I give to show why I don't think that this is true is simply because God does not mention the creation of the angels. And all I'm mentioning that for is simply to say there are things that God created that he does not mention. And the reason is the focus is on mankind, on God's creation, and on day 6 that God creates man to be his vice regent over the earth.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so that those I appreciate you picking up on those three views there. I was struggling to get the third one. Um, so um, one to me, as I was listening to your presentation, and that was an argument that I had used too from a gap theory perspective,
Yeah.
was that there, hey, where'd the water come from, right? So that was something that when you get to verse 3, hey, where'd the water come from? To me, though, Genesis 20 and verse 11. um,
You mean Exodus?
I'm sorry,
Exodus?
Exodus. Thank you. Yeah,
All right.
Exodus
Just want to
20
make sure.
verse
Yeah.
11, when he uses the term heaven and earth and God making it. Again, I could make the move and say, hey, these are different verbs from Genesis 1:1 to Exodus 20:11, and that's probably what I would have done. But it seemed to me to be like a reference to Genesis 1:1, because similar vocabulary being
Mhm.
used there. Um, so where I think I am today, and I'm trying to be really careful because, like, once you change your position on something, then you don't want to change back, right? Like you
Yeah,
got
yeah, yeah.
you don't want to change your mind again. That you just seem wishy washy then. Uh, but it seems to me, um, I liked my understanding where I am currently is tend to see that Genesis 1:1 as an independent clause, and then verse 2
Mhm.
follows from that. But I think that's the beginning of the first day. So the pushback on that obviously is the parallelism, right? You've got parallelism from the other
Yeah.
verses, right? And God said. So that was another gap theory argument that I'd used. All these other verses start with "and God
Mhm.
said." There's other parallel arguments that you can make. However, you do have the evening starting, right? The evening starts the day. And if you follow somebody like Gordon Wenham, for example, and his word biblical
Mhm.
commentary, he says, "Oh, that darkness, how we get the evening comes in verse 2. You have the darkness there." And so he actually, I tried to read him very closely, and Gordon Wenham, obviously it doesn't matter what he thinks from one standpoint, but he's a good biblical scholar. Um, didn't think that verse 3 starts day one. So if you actually start
Mhm.
day one in Genesis 1:1, which I think a lot of young Earth creationists do. But I guess I'm a little concerned about that from one standpoint. It's like, are you doing that because you're worried that somebody's going to slam some billions of years in here somewhere? So
Mhm.
maybe that's one concern. Let me come out one. I'm throwing a couple things out here, so bear with me. The other thought that I had was, okay, even if I make that move and say, and I get what you're saying, a lot of scholars are doing this. They're saying that Genesis 1 is opening up with pre-existing matter. And I don't think, Adam, maybe just one point of clarification. You do think that all that matter was created by God ex nihilo, or do you not?
Yes, I do. I do. And so does, just for clarity, like John Walton, who's even a
Sure,
theistic evolutionist. The
sure.
vast majority, I don't know any Protestant scholars who actually believe the matter was eternal. So we're all holding to God creating everything. We just don't think that's the focus of what's going on in Genesis 1.
Yeah, and those who want to take the independent clause view, number one, I think one of the good arguments in favor of it, which I think you sort of dismissed this a little bit in one of your debates, and I understand what you were saying, but uh, the fact that it is the traditional view that there is this sequence here, right? It goes from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:2. That's been widely held
Mhm.
for most of not just church history, but even Jewish history. There was one, Eben Ezer, I think it was. I'm not real up on my rabbinic scholars, but one rabbinic scholar took the second or third view, and he understood it. Oh yeah, no, the third view that you mentioned, when God created the heavens and the earth. I think the JPS edition actually translates it that way as well. But generally, people have seen this as this is the whole thing, right? This is God creating everything, and it would be really unsatisfying, Adam, to come to Genesis and say, yeah, you got to wait till you get to the Gospel of John to get creation ex nihilo, right? It would be very unsatisfying if God isn't creating everything in Genesis 1:1. Um, so a couple thoughts there, but here's one of the big ones for me. And obviously, in a debate format, this wouldn't work for anybody because you could always just say, "I'm just defending a very narrow parameters here." Um, you know, but it would be a very odd old Earth creationist who would think that the Earth is billions of years old, but the stars are only 6,000, right? From day 4, which I'm assuming you're taking some sort of functional perspective on that, like God assigned functions there. Am I right about that? Sorry, I threw out a bunch of stuff. Run with it wherever you want.
Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. So I actually wrote an article talking about the light, for instance, on day one. And so I actually think that this is much more apparent in the text than not. And that, yeah, really it has way more to do with the ordering of things. And even the notion like day four, like when it talks about, oh, the greater lights and the lesser lights and all these things, there, there's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot to really, really consider, because what we should be also paying attention to is the language of the text. And so I think it's really important that I pointed out in the debates and in my writings that there is structural symmetry, right? And there's lots of thematic elements that are connecting with one another. And so I think regardless if you want to read it even as a historical document, right? Because people can write history in certain different structures and forms. We need to be paying attention to the forms, to what's going on. And so I think if you look at day four is supposed to correlate with day one.
Mm.
So it actually correlates, right? So you have days 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6. But it also uses the similar type of language. It uses the same kind of language talking about the light and the darkness. And so, like, I think there's a lot of those things to consider. And I also think that you really have to consider the darkness that's mentioned in verse 2. Why is there darkness mentioned in verse 2 if God hasn't created light? And part of the point behind this, and I totally understand, to me, this is probably one of the last things that I try and teach or explain to somebody, because if you don't understand the rest of the structural examples, it's really, really difficult to kind of try and fit the darkness in there. But it exactly parallels the same thing as the separation of the waters and the earth, right? And day 2 is the one that I always bring up because everyone understands the separation of waters, right? It's easy for us to comprehend. Oh, he separated the waters and the waters from the land. I get that. But separating the light from the darkness is the most difficult one. And it's like, how can God separate the light from the darkness if there is no light? And people assume that when God says, let there be light, that he creates it out of nothing, right? That's an assumption, though. And I think that it's important, if you look at the textual examples that we have in there, he says, let there be birds, let there be land, let there be this. But in most of those examples, it's not literally saying that he manufactured it out of nothing, right? Let there be dry land. He's separating the land from the water. And most people understand that it's just the waters receding from the ground. It's not the manufacturing of new ground.
Yeah, I think Walton does this kind of this. It's there were several things that you said in those debates which hurt. I heard John. It sounded like John Walton kind of in the background. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that Walton's been criticized for on this is, he draws kind of this sharp distinction. Sorry for arguing with him and not you. He draws kind
That's
of this
okay.
strong distinction between material creation and this functional ordering. And I don't think he's persuaded most Hebraic scholars on this. I don't think he's
Mhm.
really persuaded that there. Yes, I think there's something to be said about the fact that there is some function that's being brought to these, right? I mean, uh, but yeah, when he calls forth certain things, it doesn't preclude material creation, and it just, I don't know, it just seems like, so when I remember reading John Walton's book and thinking, oh, this is really neat. I liked his the idea of a cosmic temple. I thought that was really cool idea.
Yeah.
And some of that I think he's probably right about. I mean, I think there is some prefiguring of the garden into some of the things you see later on in like Exodus, Leviticus, when they build the tabernacle. I think some of that's real. But I'm always like a little leery. Like they say, if it's new, it's probably not true. And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and it's like Walton's idea about this functional, he's only assigning functions. It just felt too convenient to me, to be honest with you. I'm not a Hebraist, right? So, but it just kind of felt like, if I'm being honest, if I'm being 100% honest, and I read day 4 and I get, yeah, there's complexity here that you're talking about, some of the parallelism and, dividing light and darkness. I wouldn't want to be in a debate trying to defend exactly what precisely that means. But at the same time, I'm like, do I really think that he's trying to say that stars were created then? Yeah, I do. And so if I do that, again, I could probably you could, I think, what you're saying is maybe defensible exegetically. There are people who have good Hebraic scholars who have said this is not an independent clause here. There is no sequence here. And so verse 2 is really what we're dealing with. That's, there's pre existing matter. Okay. But still, if I've got stars, right, that are being created by God, I'm at least, it was funny when I was talking to Jason Lyle. I said something about starlight being an argument against a young Earth. He said, "Well, actually, that's an argument against a young universe." And like honestly, that's not a distinction I hold in my head. If the universe is old, you follow what I'm trying to say. So I'm using too many
I
words to
do.
say it, but
I
yeah,
do.
yeah,
No, I'm totally well. So yeah, yeah. I don't want to. I want to stick with some of this other a little
yeah,
bit and
yeah.
stuff.
Go for it.
So
Yeah, please.
here's my big thing, and I actually feel like some of my arguments are helping defend Walton's view. Because like I watched, like, for example, William Lane Craig made that argument against Walton
Hmm.
and everything, and I get it. It made sense at first, but now to me, with my arguments, what I'm arguing is that verses 1 and 2 cannot be a part of day one. And yes, I'll be happy to argue against Wenham and everyone else that wants to disagree with me, but they can't be. One of the reasons is if you take verses 1 and 2 as part of day one, it destroys the symmetrical structure of Genesis, period. The entire chapter. Because now days 1 through 6 no longer coordinate. So, like, all of a sudden, it's like, hey, look, if you start in verse 3, there's this incredible symmetry throughout the entire creation account. If you start in verse 1, there isn't. Now there's no longer. Now it's asymmetrical. And it seems incredibly implausible to me that, because, for example, I list about 3 different major structural things that it seems like these are systematic. And to say that, oh, I know it looks like they're there, but they're really not. That to me, as far as being a serious biblical student, seems very disingenuous. And I haven't heard a single person, to be blunt, give any actual arguments as to why these systematic structural things exist. So I have another creation debate coming up soon. So maybe he'll give the answer. But Matt didn't really argue against any of the systematic structures. Um, Neither did Kent, for sure. And I haven't heard anybody give a rebuttal. And so to give even one final thing, which really threw me over the edge, it's the Hebrew. In Hebrew, in my opinion, it is more clear. Now, it's tough to say about some things in Hebrew because there are even debates amongst Hebrew scholars. But the evidential point that I want to point out that anybody can go and look, and nobody has contradicted it thus far, is that there's a vav consecutive that begins in verse 3. Okay. And a vav consecutive is a grammatical type. It's a thing that helps show consecutive verbs to kind of link them together in a group. Right. And so it shows that it's like, hey, this one is showing a sequence of things happening. The vav consecutive begins in verse 3 on day 1 and it ends in day 6. And so it's like, oh, again, another data point to say, if you want to start in verse 1, you are breaking all of these, what would be apparent structural things, and instead saying Genesis does not have structural consistency, but rather is asymmetrical. And I find this to be very implausible since, I'm proposing 3 or 4 different, pieces of evidence here. And so I think that, usually it's, hey, look, 1 is an accident, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern, and 3 is evidence, right? Patterns are evidence. So that's where I find some of these other arguments, and those that want to argue against the first 2 verses, I think that that's the argument that they need to contend with. And I look forward to the opposition.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, from my perspective, yeah, I've seen these some of the parallelism there, and yeah, to me, I get it, right? I really do. I think it's a good argument for starting in verse 3 day one. I don't know, to me, that it's definitive. Um, it, obviously, the first day is going to be different than all the rest of the days, just like the seventh day is going to be different than all the rest of the days to me. Obviously, like you said, there's some symmetry between the days. Um, and Wenham also points this out. So, again, to me, my honest reading of Exodus 20, and again, you could maybe argue, hey, you shouldn't be reading, but to me, it's an authoritative commentary on this, which does seem to me, Genesis 20:11 does seem to be going back to day one. So I think you've got a good argument, but to me, if I'm just being as honest as I can, I'm trying to be palms up, right? Just being as fair and honest as I can.
Mhm.
Exodus, the authoritative Mosaic commentary on Exodus or on Genesis seems to trump the structural argument. But I'm really open, and that's why I
Okay.
really wanted to talk to you about this, because I'm hoping to have a good Hebraic scholar on pretty soon, and I want to ask him
Mhm.
some of these questions too. So you're refining my questions now. So I really do appreciate it.
So let me ask you this about Exodus 20.
Hmm.
What about that says that it must be creation ex nihilo?
I don't think Exodus 20:11 gives you that.
I don't
Um,
either.
but I
So
I
then
think
why don't you think that it begins with the earth being void and formless?
yeah, because if you take Genesis 1:1 as an independent clause,
Mhm.
then I think Genesis 20:11 is referencing back to um, Genesis 1:1. And so that's encapsulating everything within that 6-day period.
Okay. So then you would think that day one begins in verse 1 and 2.
That's where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to your counter argument or somebody explaining to me why none of this stuff is actually structurally sound.
Yeah. Yeah. I like I said, I want to be as honest as I can with it.
Sure, sure.
I think it's a good argument. Um, I just don't think it's counterweighed. It doesn't counter to me what seems to be being said in Genesis and Exodus chapter 20:11. If I put it on the scales, right? Because every theory, every well-known view has evidence, right? Every
Mhm.
position has evidence, and the idea that day one starts in verse 3 isn't like some weird idea that Adam has, right? That's a very common view. It's a very easy way to read the text too. So I give it that weight, but it doesn't seem to me that Genesis 20:11, as I'm reading it right now, and it could be wrong, but it doesn't seem to allow that. But even if it did, so even if it did, let's say the days start in verse 3
Mhm.
instead of verse 1 of Genesis 1. I'm jumping around here a bit. I'm still a young earth creationist, or at least a young universe creationist, because then day 4 I don't have stars, right? Um that gets it back into the functional thing. So we've kind of come full circle on all of that. But that's kind of where I'm at right now.
I got you. I got you. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I definitely think it will have to depend because I think that you need to exegete Genesis 1 first, and then Exodus 20 is referring to Genesis 1. So, and I think that the first two verses are more so the summary idea. So it's a summary idea of this is how God created the heavens and the earth. And so that's what I think that Exodus 20 is referring to. And that what's going on in Genesis 1 is that the rest of the text presupposes that when God creates the heavens and the earth, there is existing matter. And so I think that, yeah, when Exodus 20 says, yeah, God created the heavens and the earth, I think that number one, of course, its primary point is that it is pointing to God's sovereignty over all of the heavens and the earth, and that he is the one who orchestrated and announces and says what everything is. So I think that that is, yeah, first and foremost primary. And then after that, yeah, Exodus 20 is talking about how God created everything from the earth that was present. So that's,
Mm,
yeah, in short. And that's the part where I feel like my struggle in communicating or, in talking with everyone is that we have a very strong intuition, in my opinion. I mean, because like I said, I was a young earth creationist. So it's not like I've never been there, right? But we have a very strong intuition that when it says God made all these things, we have an idea of like what that means. And so I just think that, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and so it's a good thing it's not a debate because I think I would retract something I said, and that's not good in a debate. It's better for me to be a conversation with somebody who knows what they're talking about on these things. But yeah, maybe I do think that Genesis 20:11 gets you because if the verbs, it's bara and asa, right?
And
That's
that's
two verbs. Yeah,
yes, you are correct. So kudos
yeah,
to you for that, sir.
yeah. It so my understanding is I see those as basically being used synonymously here, and feel free to
Mhm.
correct me, but that's how I see it. And so I guess if heavens and earth is a merism, right? So a Hebrew way of saying the whole shebang. I guess I would probably get a whole. I guess Exodus 2011 would be creation ex nihilo for me. I guess what I was trying to say when I responded too quickly is that um, the verb asa often can be used of pre-existing materials, but the same thing with bara, right? Too. I mean, that can be used of pre-existing materials as well. I know it's only used in reference to God, right? So only God can be the subject of that verb. Um, but it seems to me if it's I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess it's possible to read Exodus 20:11 that way, where it's not the whole shebang. But I guess I don't. I think it. I think that is the. I think that is a creation ex nihilo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of controversy over it, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I just think it's like, well, when I go back and read Genesis 1, it's not. So, and I don't think that everyone was confused about what Genesis 1 said up to Exodus 20. And then they understood what it meant only at Exodus 20. And so that's why I think it's really important. And this is something that I've been struggling with many people in conversations concerning different Bible passages is they're using certain other texts to interpret another text, but the interpretation they're getting from the later text is something that you could not derive from the earlier view. And I think that that's significant. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily the case in this case, but I do think that if you don't have a strong explanation of Genesis 1 in and of itself, then I think that it is much more difficult to say that Exodus 20 is making this huge explanation that's beyond what Genesis 1 seems to be saying.
yeah, yeah. I understand what you're saying there. It, I guess the we have to make a lot of to me we have to make quite a few assumptions about how the ancient people were reading Genesis 1 and that the parallelism for them necessarily meant that verse 3 started the sequence of days. Um, to me, what Exodus 20 gives us is actually how they did read it. In other words, um,